bank teller didn't even look up when she said the balance was zero. $20 billion hadn't just vanished, it had never existed. Adrian Kessler felt the oxygen leave the room, his lungs collapsing as if the reinforced glass of the private wealth vault had suddenly become a vacuum. Just 24 hours ago, he was the Duke of Wall Street, a man whose signature could move markets and whose divorce had cleared the path for a dynastic fortune. Now he was a man standing in a bespoke $4,000 suit, holding a titanium debit card that had just been spat out by a machine like a piece of worthless plastic. The void status on the screen glowed in a haunting, digital red, mocking the man who had traded his soul for a number that had evaporated before the ink on his divorce papers was even dry. The stakes were not just financial, they were existential. Every bridge Adrian had ever built was currently engulfed in flames, and he had been the one to strike the match. To qualify for the $20 billion merger with Aegis Global, he had been forced to trigger a dynastic purity clause, a ruthless legal mechanism that required him to be legally and financially unencumbered by low-tier domestic liabilities. In his hubris, he hadn't seen his wife, Naomi, or their 3 infants, Elias, Ileana, and Everett, as a family. He had seen them as a $50,000 a year overhead cost that was standing in the way of a $20 billion future. He had betrayed the only people who loved him for a phantom, and as he looked at the empty ledger, the crushing weight of his isolation began to set in. If the money wasn't there, he wasn't just broke, he was a pariah. Conflict erupted in the quiet vault as the reality of his ruin clawed at his throat. There must be a mistake, Adrian's voice cracked, the sound echoing off the Italian marble walls. He slammed his fist against the mahogany counter, startling the silent, high-net-worth clients in the adjacent booths. I am Adrian Kessler. I signed the Aegis merger. That wire was confirmed by my counsel at midnight. Check the routing numbers again, or I'll have this entire branch liquidated by noon. He was screaming at a system that no longer recognized his name. The prestige he had spent a decade building was disappearing in real time, replaced by the panicked sweat of a man who realized he had jumped off a cliff without a parachute. The inciting incident had occurred exactly 24 hours prior in the clinical cold of his penthouse office. He had watched Naomi's heart break in slow motion as he slid the divorce papers across the desk, his eyes cold and his heart hardened by the promise of the Aegis billions. He had told her she was stagnant, that the triplets were anchors, and that he was meant for a higher stratosphere of power. He had signed away his fatherhood and his marriage with a gold-nibbed pen, believing he was ascending to godhood. But as the bank teller finally turned the screen toward him, Adrian saw the truth. The Aegis Global merger wasn't a business deal, it was a trap. Every asset he owned, his real estate, his stock, his very name, had been used as collateral to bridge a merger that was legally designed to fail. The closing tease hung in the air like a guillotine. As Adrian's phone buzzed with a final, devastating alert, he saw a photo sent from an encrypted source. It was Naomi, dressed in a stunning emerald green gown, standing in the center of the city square. She wasn't crying. She wasn't the broken woman he had left in the nursery. She was surrounded by a phalanx of attorneys, and behind her, the giant digital ticker of the stock exchange displayed a new acquisition, Aegis Global bought by the Fairchild Trust. Adrian's blood turned to ice as he realized Fairchild was Naomi's maiden name, a name he had never bothered to investigate. He hadn't just divorced a housewife, he had declared war on the heiress of the empire he was trying to join. And now, she held the leash to his life. The silence that followed the teller's words was heavier than the gold bars stored beneath his feet. Adrian looked down at his hands, hands that had never known manual labor, hands that had only ever signed checks and adjusted silk ties. They were shaking. The adrenaline that had fueled his 24-hour victory lap had curdled into a sickening, acidic dread. He remembered the smell of the penthouse last night, the scent of lavender baby powder and the expensive perfume Naomi wore only on their anniversaries. It was their 7th. He had let her cook a 5-course meal, let her talk about the triplets' first steps, and let her believe they were celebrating a lifetime together. Then, between the dessert and the coffee, he had destroyed her. He had done it with the clinical precision of a surgeon, explaining that his new life had no room for the clutter of a domestic routine. Mr. Kessler, the teller said, her voice now holding a sharp edge of authority, Security has been notified. Since your accounts are voided and your collateral has been seized by the Aegis Trust, you are no longer a client of this institution. You are, in fact, trespassing. Trespassing, Adrian let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. I built this city's portfolio. I am the Duke of Wall Street. You were, she corrected him, her eyes fixed on her monitor. But according to the latest filing, the Kessler Group has been dissolved. Its assets were absorbed at 8:01 a.m. this morning. The person who signed the dissolution papers, well, I believe you know her, Naomi Kessler. Adrian felt a surge of bile. It wasn't possible. Naomi didn't know a spreadsheet from a grocery list, or so he had convinced himself. He had spent 7 years gaslighting her into believing she was just a mother, ensuring she remained small so he could feel giant. He had hidden his business dealings from her, never realizing she was the daughter of the very man who had mentored the CEO of Aegis Global. He had been so blinded by his own reflection in the glass towers that he hadn't noticed the shadow she cast. He stumbled away from the counter, his legs feeling like lead. As he reached the lobby, the towering glass doors that usually opened automatically for him, remained shut. 2 large men in black suits stepped into his path. They didn't look like bank security, they looked like mercenaries. Mr. Kessler, one of them said, his voice a low rumble. We've been instructed to escort you to the square. There's someone waiting to finalize the divorce settlement. Adrian's mind flashed to the $20 billion. It wasn't just gone, it was being used as a weapon. He realized now that the merger agreement had a character clause. By abandoning his family for money, he had triggered a hidden breach of contract. He hadn't just failed a business deal, he had failed a test of humanity, and the price of his failure was everything he had ever touched. As the guards gripped his arms, dragging him toward the exit, the high-octane reality of his ruin hit the pavement. Outside, the sun was blindingly bright, reflecting off the chrome of the luxury cars he no longer owned. He saw the crowd gathered in the square. He saw the cameras, and there, on a raised platform, sat Naomi. She wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. She was the judge, the jury, and the person who now owned every second of his future. The $20 billion hadn't vanished. It was sitting right there in her hands, and she was about to show the world what happens when a duke tries to sell his kingdom for a handful of silver. The scent of rosemary-crusted lamb and expensive Bordeaux filled the dining room of the Kessler penthouse, a space that felt more like a cathedral to high finance than a family home. Candlelight flickered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting the shimmering lights of the city below, a city Adrian Kessler believed he finally owned. It was their 7th anniversary, and Naomi had spent the better part of the day preparing. She sat across from him in a simple silk dress, her face radiant with a softness that Adrian now found nauseating. To him, her warmth was no longer a comfort. It was a friction burn against the cold, hard ambition of his new reality. In the nursery down the hall, the triplets, Elias, Ileana, and Everett, were finally asleep. The quiet was absolute, save for the soft clink of Naomi's fork against the fine china. She looked at him, her eyes misting with an affection that Adrian planned to extinguish within the hour. 7 years, Adrian, she whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Through the lean years when you were just starting the firm, and through the madness of the last 3, I'm so proud of what we've built, not just the company, but this, our family. Adrian didn't pull his hand away immediately. He let her touch him, feeling the heat of her skin and the weight of the gold band on her finger. To her, that ring was a symbol of a sacred vow. To him, it was a piece of depreciating hardware. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw exactly what the board of Aegis Global had warned him about. He saw a woman whose world was bounded by school schedules, organic meal prep, and the mundane rhythms of domesticity. She was a $50,000 a year habit in a $20 billion world. The firm is changing, Naomi, Adrian said, his voice as flat and clinical as a surgeon's report. He didn't return her smile. He didn't squeeze her hand. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal Tom Ford suit and pulled out a slender vellum envelope. He placed it on the table between the lamb and the wine, sliding it toward her with the same practiced grace he used to close a mid-cap acquisition. Naomi blinked, her hand retreating. What is this? An anniversary trip. Adrian, you know we can't leave the Barbies for long, but if your mother can come up from. Open it, he commanded. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the room. As Naomi pulled out the documents, the color drained from her face so rapidly it was as if a plug had been pulled beneath her skin. Her eyes darted across the bold headers: petition for dissolution of marriage, custody waiver, asset settlement. Adrian, her voice was a ragged thread. I don't. Is this a joke? Is this some kind of tax strategy for the merger? You're scaring me. It's not a joke, and it's not a strategy. It's a requirement, Adrian said, leaning back and crossing his legs. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the Bordeaux, savoring the tannins. I've spent the last 6 months negotiating the largest merger in the history of this sector. Aegis Global isn't just a conglomerate, it's a dynasty. They don't invest in family men. They invest in titans. The dynastic purity clause in our contract is very specific. I must be legally unencumbered. No domestic distractions. No shared assets that can be frozen in a spousal dispute. No anchors dragging down the valuation. Anchors, Naomi's voice rose, a sharp, hysterical edge cutting through the room. You're talking about your children, Adrian. Elia's just started walking. Ileana looks exactly like you. How can you call them anchors? Adrian set his glass down with a sharp clack. I'm talking about my life, Naomi, my real life. For 7 years I've played the role. I've come home to the smell of diapers and the sound of crying. I've sat through mind-numbing stories about the playground and the grocery store. I've tolerated your small life because it was a useful mask while I climbed. But I've reached the summit now, and the air up here is too thin for 5 people. I'm moving into a $20 billion future, and quite frankly, you're a liability I can no longer afford to carry. He stood up, walking to the window to look out at the skyline. He felt a surge of electricity, the sheer power of his own coldness making him feel invincible. Look at yourself, Naomi, he sneered, turning back to her. You've become a cliché. You're a $50,000 a year habit. That's what it costs to keep you fed, clothed, and housed in this lifestyle. You contribute nothing to the bottom line. You don't understand the language of the board. You don't understand the pressure of the market. You think wealth is a full refrigerator and a happy nursery. I think wealth is the power to reshape the world's economy. We are no longer the same species. Naomi stood up, her hands trembling so violently that the table shook, causing the candles to flicker and die. I gave up my career for you. I gave up my name. I stayed home so you could build your empire. I was the one who sat up with you until 4:00 a.m. when the Kessler Group almost went under 3 years ago. I gave you everything. And I'm paying you for it, Adrian snapped. The settlement in that envelope is more than fair. You'll have a comfortable life in the suburbs. You can take the triplets and find a nice, quiet house with a yard where you can be as small as you want. But you will sign those papers tonight. The Aegis representatives are meeting me at midnight to verify my status. If I'm not a single man by the time the sun rises, the deal is dead. And if the deal dies, I will make sure your comfortable settlement disappears with it. He walked over to her, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. The mask of the loving husband had vanished, replaced by the Duke of Wall Street, a predator who saw only profit and loss. Don't be difficult, Naomi. You were a good wife for the $100 million version of me, but you have no place in the world of the $20 billion man. Sign the papers, take the kids, and disappear quietly. Don't make me treat you like a hostile takeover. Naomi looked at him, and for a second, the sorrow in her eyes was replaced by something else, a flash of something ancient and terrifyingly calm. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she simply picked up the gold pen he had left on the table. You really think money is the only language people speak, don't you, Adrian? She asked, her voice dangerously low. It's the only language that matters, he replied, checking his Patek Philippe. You have 10 minutes, my driver is waiting, I have a kingdom to claim. As he walked out of the room, leaving her standing amidst the ruins of their 7th anniversary, Adrian felt a sense of profound relief. He was finally free of the habit. He was finally unencumbered. He didn't see Naomi pick up the phone. He didn't hear her whisper 4 words that would change the trajectory of his life forever. The Duke has fallen. Adrian Kessler walked toward the elevator, his head held high, unaware that in exactly 24 hours, The $20 billion he had just traded his family for would become the very wall that would crush him into the dust. He was a king for a night, but the queen he had just discarded was about to show him that some habits are much more expensive than they appear. The air in the private club atop the obsidian tower was thin, filtered, and smelled of ancient cedar and cold, hard ambition. Adrian Kessler adjusted his cuffs as he stepped off the private elevator. This was the inner sanctum of the world's financial elite, a place where names weren't spoken, only net worths were measured. At exactly midnight, the city below looked like a circuit board of glowing gold and silver, but Adrian's eyes were fixed on the far end of the room. There, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling glass, stood three figures in charcoal suits. They were the emissaries of Aegis Global, the dynastic architects. Adrian's pulse hammered against his ribs, but he maintained the predatory stride that had earned him his reputation. He felt lighter, dangerously so. The weight of the divorce papers he had left with Naomi was gone, replaced by a vacuum of pure potential. He had done the unthinkable. He had cut his own heart out to make room for a check. Mr. Kessler, the central figure, spoke. He was a man who looked like he was carved from flint, his hair a shock of silver, his eyes 2 chips of frozen lake water. You are punctual, a trait we find increasingly rare in men of your generation. I don't believe in wasting time, Adrian replied, taking his seat at the center of a triangular glass table. Time is the only asset we can't hedge. I've delivered on my end of the bargain. The domestic encumbrances have been severed. The filing is in the system. As of 1 hour ago, I am a man of singular focus. The silver-haired man, whose name was simply Mr. Thorne, opened a leather-bound folder. Inside sat the final merger agreement, a document that represented the keys to a $20 billion kingdom. But Thorne didn't hand him a pen. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching long across the table. You must understand why we require this, Adrian, Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. Aegis Global does not invest in companies. We invest in legacies. Most men fail because they are divided. They have wives who demand their time, children who cloud their judgment with sentiment, and domestic habits that drain their focus and their capital. A man with a family is a man with a leash, and a man with a leash can be led away from the objective. Adrian nodded, his face a mask of cold agreement. I've already concluded as much. My family was a $50,000 a year distraction. I've liquidated the emotional overhead. Goes deeper than overhead, Thorne countered, tapping a specific section of the contract titled the Dynastic Purity Clause. This clause is the bedrock of our conglomerate. We operate on a 1,000-year horizon. We do not allow outsiders to inherit the influence we build. By divorcing your wife and waiving your rights to your heirs, you have ensured that the $20 billion stays within the bloodline of the corporation. You aren't just getting a payout, Adrian. You are being grafted into a new tree, but a graft only takes if the old branches are burnt to ash. The second emissary, a woman with a face as sharp as a diamond-cut blade, spoke for the first time. We've watched your career, Mr. Kessler. You have the hunger, but hunger is often tempered by the soft hands of a wife at home. Naomi Kessler was a complication. She represented the version of you that was satisfied with 100 million. Aegis has no use for a man who is satisfied. We need the man who is willing to be hollowed out so that we can fill him with power. Adrian felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but a momentary vertigo. He thought of the triplets' nursery, the way Elia's hand felt when it gripped his thumb. He quickly crushed the thought. That hand was a tether. That hand was the reason he was currently worth millions instead of billions. I understand, Adrian said, his voice steadying. The clause requires me to be unattached so that my loyalty is vertical to the board rather than horizontal to a household. I am ready to be hollowed out. Thorne smiled, a thin, mirthless line. It is a rare man who understands the price of divinity. Most want the throne without the sacrifice. They want the $20 billion and the Sunday dinner. They don't realize that the dinner is the very thing that makes them weak. It makes them vulnerable to litigation, to emotional blackmail, to the habit of being human. By signing this, you are becoming a corporate sovereign. You will have no heirs but the company, no home but the office, no God but the ledger. He slid the document across the table. The dynastic purity clause was highlighted in a pale, ghostly blue. It stated that should Adrian ever attempt to reconcile with his former family or should any asset from the merger be funneled toward them, the entire $20 billion would be forfeited instantly to the Aegis Trust. It was a total severance, a legal lobotomy of his personal life. The money is currently sitting in a digital escrow, the woman added, but it requires a bad faith trigger. If you have lied to us, if there is any lingering connection to that woman or those children, the system will detect it. Our auditors have access to your biometric data, your GPS, your communications. The moment you sign this, you are ours, and if you are ours, the world is yours. Adrian looked at the gold pen resting on the glass. He could almost hear the silence of the penthouse he had just left. He imagined Naomi sitting in the dark, her world shattered. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the ultimate trade. He was selling his past to buy the future. I have no lies, Adrian said, his fingers closing around the pen. The habit is broken, the leash is cut. Then sign, Thorne whispered, and let the Duke of Wall Street be reborn. Adrian pressed the nib to the paper. He didn't just sign his name, he signed his soul into a vault. As the ink dried, the computer screen at the end of the table flickered to life, showing a series of complex routing numbers. The golden handcuff merger was live. The transfer of his personal assets into the Aegis collateral pool was initiated. He was now a billionaire in waiting, tied to a conglomerate that demanded everything he was and everything he would ever be. He stood up, feeling a cold wind of power swirling around him. He didn't know that as he walked out of that room, a silent alert had already been sent from the bank's server. He didn't know that the bad faith trigger was already humming, or that the dynastic purity he had just sworn to uphold was about to be turned against him. Welcome to the family, Mr. Kessler, Thorne said, though his eyes remained as cold as a grave. Try not to miss your old one. It would be a very expensive mistake. Adrian stepped into the elevator, the doors closing like the lid of a casket. He was a $20 billion man. He was the king of the world. And as he descended into the night, he didn't realize that he had just handed the keys to his prison to the woman he had called a liability. The clock was ticking. He had 24 hours left before the void would swallow him whole. The world of Adrian Kessler was a symphony of crystal and chrome, a high-altitude sanctuary of excess where the air smelled of imported lilies and the condensation on chilled magnums of crystal. While the city slept, the rooftop lounge of the St. Regis was ablaze with the celebration of a titan. Adrian stood at the center of a swirling vortex of models, hedge fund managers, and political power players, his laughter ringing out like a victor's bell. He was no longer just a man. He was a monument to the successful execution of the dynastic purity clause. Every toast raised in his honor was a confirmation that he had made the right choice. He had traded the habit of a family for the immortality of an empire. To the Duke, a voice cried out, a billionaire developer from Dubai. To the man who knows that the only thing more expensive than a merger is a marriage. Adrian tipped his glass, the liquid gold of the champagne catching the light of the chandeliers. To the future, he replied, his voice projecting a confidence that masked the hollow ache in his chest he refused to acknowledge. To a world where sentiment doesn't cloud the balance sheet. But as the camera flashes popped, and the music thrummed through the floorboards, the split screen of his reality was unfolding 5 miles away in the shadows of the East Side. Naomi Kessler stood in the center of a different kind of room. It wasn't a cathedral of glass. It was a 400-square-foot studio apartment that smelled of damp plaster and industrial cleaner. The walls were scarred with the marks of previous tenants, and the single window looked out not at the skyline, but at a brick wall. This was the comfort Adrian's settlement had initially provided before the bank accounts were frozen. She wasn't wearing silk. She was wearing an old, oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. In the center of the room sat 3 cardboard boxes, the sum total of what she had been allowed to take from the penthouse in the 2 hours Adrian's lawyers had given her. Elias, Ileana, and Everett were tucked into a makeshift nest of blankets on a second-hand mattress in the corner. They were restless, their tiny whimpers echoing in the empty space. They didn't understand the dynastic clause. They only knew that the smell of their father was gone and the warmth of their nursery had been replaced by a drafty room in a building that groaned with every passing subway train. Back at the St. Regis, Adrian was being cornered by a tech mogul who was interested in a partnership with the new Aegis Kessler entity. I heard the terms were steep, Adrian, a total severance. That's cold even for you. Adrian didn't blink. He took a bite of a beluga caviar blini, the saltiness exploding on his tongue. Cold is just another word for efficient. You can't reach orbit if you're carrying the weight of the atmosphere. My ex-wife is taken care of. She has her life, I have mine. The triplets will have trust funds they can access when they're 30, provided they meet the corporate conduct requirements. Until then, they are part of a past I've outgrown. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he spoke the words. It was a performance, a ritual of detachment that he had to repeat until it became his truth. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored pillar, the perfect suit, the perfect watch, the perfect life. He was a $20 billion man. In the studio apartment, Naomi knelt by one of the cardboard boxes. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. Inside the box wasn't just clothing or diapers. Tucked beneath a stack of baby blankets was a slim, encrypted laptop and a series of heavy, wax-sealed envelopes she had retrieved from a floor safe Adrian never knew existed, a safe her father had installed when they first moved in. She opened the laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating the grit and determination in her eyes. She wasn't looking at small things. She wasn't looking at grocery lists or playground schedules. She was looking at the back-end servers of the Aegis Global Trust. You called me a $50,000 a year habit, Adrian, she whispered to the empty, cold room. You thought I was the one living on your charity. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keys with a precision that would have terrified the Duke had he been there to see it. Every time Adrian raised his glass at the gala, Naomi was dismantling a brick in his fortress. She wasn't just a mother, she was the invisible architect. The daughter of the man who had founded the very conglomerate Adrian had just signed his life over to. Adrian had spent 7 years underestimating her, seeing only the woman who folded his laundry and kissed his cheek. He hadn't seen the woman who had been tutored in forensic accounting since she was 12. He hadn't seen the woman who had deliberately played the role of the quiet wife to see if the man she loved was a partner or a predator. Tonight, he had given her his answer. At the gala, the party reached its fever pitch. Adrian was ushered to a private table where a contract for a new private jet awaited his signature. Sign here, Mr. Kessler, a beautiful assistant purred. A gift from the board for your sacrifices. Adrian picked up the pen, the gold nib glinting. He felt like a god. At that exact moment, Naomi hit the enter key in the dark studio. Transfer initiated, she murmured. The $20 billion wasn't a gift. It was a lure, and Adrian had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. While he celebrated his freedom with champagne and strangers, Naomi was using the bad faith trigger he had signed in Chapter 2 to initiate a total asset freeze. She wasn't taking his money to be rich. She was taking it to render him invisible. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Adrian stepped out onto the balcony of the St. Regis. The cold morning air hitting his face. He felt like he was on top of the world. He didn't know that his black cards were already being deactivated. He didn't know that his private jet was being deregistered. Down in the studio, Naomi pulled a single emerald green dress from the bottom of the box. She held it against her, looking into a cracked mirror. 24 hours, Adrian, she said, her voice steady and cold. In 24 hours, you'll realize that the habit you couldn't afford was your only protection against the world I'm about to show you. She sat down on the floor next to her sleeping children, leaning her head against a cardboard box. The Duke was partying in the clouds, but the Queen was grounded, focused, and ready for war. The split screen was about to merge into a single, devastating reality. The sun hung high over Manhattan, a searing orb of gold that seemed to validate Adrian Kessler's new status. It had been exactly 12 hours since he had signed the dynastic purity clause and walked out of his old life. He hadn't slept, but he didn't need to. The adrenaline of the $20 billion merger was a more potent stimulant than any espresso or pharmaceutical. He felt electric, his skin humming with the friction of newfound power. To celebrate the first half-day of his reign as a sovereign entity, Adrian decided he needed a new chariot, something that screamed, tighten, louder than the Mercedes Maybach he had left for Naomi to eventually lose in the repossession. He stepped out of his private car in front of Veloce Automobili, the city's most exclusive boutique dealership. The showroom was a palace of carbon fiber and Italian leather, housing machines that cost more than most small-town hospitals. Adrian walked in, his chest out, the Duke of Wall Street persona draped over him like a suit of armor. Mr. Kessler, the manager, a man named Lorenzo who specialized in sycophancy, gushed as he hurried across the polished floor. "We saw the news this morning. The Aegis merger, historic, truly historic. I assume you aren't here for a mere oil change." Adrian offered a thin, shark-like smile. "I'm here for the Pagani Huayra Roadster BC, the one in the window, cobalt blue carbon weave." Lorenzo's eyes widened. "A $4 million masterpiece, a fitting choice for a man of your updated stature. Shall we handle the paperwork in the private lounge?" Adrian waved him off. "Let's do it here. I have a board meeting at 2. I want to drive it out of the showroom." He felt the eyes of the other high-net-worth clients in the room. This was what he had traded the triplets for, this moment of pure, unadulterated envy from his peers. This was the oxygen he craved. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, a bespoke alligator skin case, and withdrew his Centurion black card. It was the ultimate signifier of limitless. It was a card that could buy a jet, a yacht, or a small island without a phone call to a banker. Lorenzo took the card with both hands, as if it were a holy relic. He walked over to the sleek, minimalist terminal and swiped it. The silence that followed was small at first, then deafening. The machine let out a sharp, discordant beep, a sound of rejection. "Our technology," Lorenzo chuckled nervously, his brow beginning to dampen. "The chip must be acting up. Allow me to try the manual entry." Adrian leaned against a $1 million fender, crossing his arms. "It's a new card sequence for the merger accounts. The bank is probably just catching up to the volume." Lorenzo typed in the numbers, his fingers flying. He hit the enter key with a flourish. "Transaction declined. Contact issuer." The red text on the screen was small, but to Adrian, it looked like a neon sign in a dark alley. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of sweat at the base of his neck. "Try it again," Adrian said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its festive lilt. "Use the secondary line, the one tied to the Aegis escrow." Lorenzo's smile was beginning to fray at the edges. The sycophancy was being replaced by a professional, clinical caution. He tried the card a third time. "Account status, void." "I'm sorry, Mr. Kessler," Lorenzo said, his voice no longer gushing. He held the card out, returning it to Adrian not with both hands, but between two fingers. "The system is reporting the account as voided, not over the limit, not flagged for fraud, voided, as in, it no longer exists." "That's impossible," Adrian snapped, snatching the card back. "I just moved 20 billion into that ledger. I have a confirmation of the wire from Aegis Global." "Perhaps there's a delay with the offshore clearing," Lorenzo suggested, though he was already signaling to a junior salesman to move the velvet rope back in front of the Pagani. "But until the funds are verified, I cannot release the vehicle." Adrian pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the contact for his private banker. "I'll have this cleared up in 30 seconds. You'll be apologizing for the rest of the month, Lorenzo." He dialed the number. Usually it didn't even ring. The banker would pick up on the first half tone, eager to serve. This time it rang and rang and rang. Finally, it went to a generic automated system. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." Adrian's heart did a slow, sickening roll in his chest. He felt a sudden wave of vertigo, the bright lights of the showroom becoming too much to bear. He looked around. The other clients were whispering, their eyes darting from him to the rejected card in his hand. The Duke was being humbled in the one place he felt most at home, a temple of commerce. He opened his banking app, his fingers trembling. He bypassed the biometric lock and went straight to the Assets tab. Yesterday, that screen had been a mountain of green. Today, it was a flat gray plane. Balance $0. Beneath it, in the transaction history, a single line of text appeared in a font that looked like it had been written in ice. Reversal 4 cause, dynastic purity breach. Adrian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Breach? What breach? He had done exactly what they asked. He had divorced Naomi. He had walked away from the children. He had scrubbed his life clean of every domestic habit that Aegis Global had deemed a liability. He rushed out of the dealership, ignoring Lorenzo's calls for him to have a nice day. He didn't wait for his driver. He started running toward the corporate headquarters of Aegis Global, only 6 blocks away. As he moved through the midday crowd, he felt a strange sensation. For the first time in 10 years, he felt invisible. People were bumping into his expensive suit, ignoring his presence. The aura of the billionaire was gone. Without the money, he was just another man in a suit running down a sidewalk in a city that didn't care if he lived or died. He reached the black glass monolith of the Aegis building. He strode toward the security desk, pulling out his titanium ID badge. Adrian Kessler, I need to see Mr. Thorne, immediately. The guard looked at the badge, then at a printed list on his desk. He didn't even touch the ID. I'm sorry, sir, Mr. Kessler is no longer on the access list. I am the partner, Adrian roared, slamming his hand on the desk. I am the CEO of the Kessler Group. We merged yesterday. The Kessler Group was dissolved at 8:01 a.m., the guard said, his voice flat. The assets were absorbed into the Fairchild Trust. You are listed as a terminated entity for a bad faith violation. Fairchild, Adrian whispered, the name hitting him like a physical blow. He remembered Naomi's maiden name, Naomi Fairchild. He had always thought she came from a modest background. Some Midwestern family of no consequence. He had never looked into her history because he had been too busy looking at his own. He looked up at the digital ticker running across the lobby. Aegis Global, new chairperson ANNOUNCD, NAOMIKSSLER. The world turned white. Adrian felt his knees buckle, the cold marble of the lobby floor rising up to meet him. In exactly 12 hours, he had gone from a $20 billion man to a man whose very name was a voided account. He pulled his phone out one last time. A new message sat in his inbox. No text, just a photo of his own front door at the penthouse. His boxes were on the curb, and standing on the top step, dressed in an emerald green dress that looked like it cost more than his car, was Naomi. She wasn't holding a grocery list. She was holding his life in her hands, and she was crushing it. The black card in his pocket felt like a piece of shrapnel, a reminder that the only thing more dangerous than a man with $20 billion is a woman who knows exactly how he stole it. The rain began as a fine mist and quickly devolved into a torrential downpour, mirroring the sudden, violent dissolution of Adrian Kessler's reality. He sat in the back of a yellow taxi. The only transport he could flag down after his private driver had been remotely locked out of the company car. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and cheap air freshener, a far cry from the hermetically sealed luxury he had occupied just hours ago. On his lap sat a leather briefcase containing the physical copies of the Aegis Global merger. These were the golden handcuffs, the 400-page testament to his brilliance, or so he had thought. As the taxi crawled through the gridlocked arteries of Manhattan, Adrian's fingers fumbled with the brass latches of the case. His hands were shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor that he couldn't suppress. He pulled out the heavy stack of vellum paper. He needed to find the loophole. He needed to find the error that the bank system was surely suffering from. A man of his caliber didn't just lose $20 billion because of a bad faith flag. There had to be a legal remedy. He flipped past the preamble, past the dynastic purity clause that he had so proudly signed, and deep into the technical appendices, the sections he had skimmed while dreaming of Pagani roadsters and private islands. His eyes, sharp and trained for the hunt, began to scan the fine print of Section 14.2, the collateral bridge. His breath hitched. The wording was subtle, a masterpiece of linguistic camouflage. In a standard merger, assets are pooled to create a new entity, but here, the language didn't describe a pooling. It described a unilateral conveyance. The document didn't say that the Kessler Group was merging with Aegis. It said that the Kessler Group was indemnifying Aegis. "No," Adrian whispered, his voice lost in the roar of the taxi's windshield wipers. "No, that can't be right." He pulled a gold-plated magnifying glass from his case, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He read the line again. "The signatory, Adrian Kessler, hereby agrees that all existing personal and corporate holdings, including but not limited to intellectual property, real estate, and liquid capital, shall serve as an irrevocable asset transfer deed to the Fairchild Trust in the event of a dynastic breach." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't signed a merger. He had signed a suicide note. The merger was a shell, a hollow vessel designed to lure him into a legal kill zone. By signing the papers while unencumbered, he had activated a clause that allowed the Fairchild Trust to absorb his entire life's work the moment a character clause was violated. And the violation wasn't his divorce, it was the act of the divorce itself. The very thing they told him to do was the trigger that allowed them to take everything. He had been played, not by a board of directors, but by the woman who used to make his coffee. "Turn around," Adrian screamed at the driver, slamming his hand against the plexiglass divider. "Take me to the Fairchild building on 42nd. Now." "Hey, pal, relax," the driver grunted, but he swung the cab into a harrowing U-turn. Adrian's mind was a kaleidoscope of horror. He looked at the signature on the final page. His own hand, bold and arrogant, had pennied the document that turned his $100 million firm into a $0 gift to his ex-wife. He realized now why the board had never met him, why the emissaries, Thorne and the woman, had been so focused on his hollowing out. They weren't welcoming him into a new family. They were cleaning out the house before they evicted the tenant. He scrambled for his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for Marcus, his head of legal. He needed a litigator. He needed a war cabinet. "Marcus, tell me you're looking at the Fairchild transfer," Adrian barked the moment the call connected. "Adrian," Marcus's voice was strained, distant. "I can't talk to you, Adrian. I've been retained." "Retained by who? I pay your retainer." "Not anymore," Marcus said, and for the first time, Adrian heard a note of genuine pity in the lawyer's voice. "The Fairchild Trust exercised a keyman acquisition on my firm this morning. I'm currently looking at your signature on the deed of transfer, Adrian. You signed over the legal department, the office leases, and the proprietary algorithms. You don't have a lawyer, Adrian. You don't even have a desk." "I'll sue," Adrian roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "It's fraud. It's a bait-and-switch." "It's a perfectly legal contract signed by a sophisticated party," Marcus replied. "You wanted to be the smartest man in the room, Adrian. You just didn't realize the room was a trap. And honestly, the bad faith evidence they have on you, the way you spoke to Naomi in that penthouse, it's all on record. They used your own narcissism as the legal basis for the breach. You proved you weren't fit to manage the assets. Goodbye, Adrian." The line went dead. The taxi skidded to a halt in front of the Fairchild building. It was a soaring spire of emerald glass, glowing in the grey afternoon like a taunting jewel. Adrian stepped out into the rain, his briefcase falling into a puddle, the vellum pages soaking up the filthy street water. He didn't care. The paper trail he had followed his whole life had led him to a dead end in the middle of a storm. He looked up at the top floor. He could almost feel Naomi's gaze from the penthouse suite. She had known. Every time he had called her a liability, every time he had mocked her small life, she had been sitting on the board of the most powerful trust in the hemisphere. She hadn't stayed with him for his money. She had stayed with him to see if he would ever choose her over the gold. And the moment he chose the $20 billion, she had pulled the lever. Adrian stood on the sidewalk, a man who once owned the sky. Now shivering in a suit that cost more than the taxi he couldn't even afford to tip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He wanted to call her. He wanted to beg. But as he looked at the screen, he saw a notification from a news app. Market alert, Kessler Group absorbed. Naomi Fairchild named CEO of Aegis Fairchild conglomerate, triplets to inherit majority share. The dynastic purity clause had been fulfilled. The wealth was pure, it was safe, it was hers. Adrian let out a guttural, primal scream into the rain, but the sound was swallowed by the city's indifferent roar. The Duke was gone. Only the void remained. He had spent his life chasing a number, only to find out that the number was a zero, and the paper trail was a circle that led right back to the woman he had destroyed. "I have nothing," he whispered, the realization finally breaking his spirit. "I have absolutely nothing." But the city wasn't finished with him yet. As he stood there, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a man in a familiar charcoal suit stepped out. It was Thorne. He didn't look like a business partner anymore. He looked like an undertaker. "Mr. Kessler," Thorne said, holding out an umbrella. "The chairperson would like to see you now, not in the office, in the square, where the world can see the Duke in his new kingdom." The trap was closing. The paper trail to nowhere had one final destination: public humiliation. The lobby of the Kessler Tower had always been Adrian's private temple, a cathedral of glass and brushed steel that echoed with the footsteps of people who feared him. But as he pushed through the revolving doors, drenched to the bone and shivering with a mixture of rage and hypothermia, the air felt different. It was cold, not the controlled, air-conditioned chill of luxury, but the stagnant, airless cold of a tomb. The familiar scent of expensive sandalwood and success had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Adrian didn't stop to shake off the rain. He stormed toward the executive elevator bank, his eyes fixed on the private lift that led directly to the 60th floor boardroom. "Mr. Kessler," a voice barked from the security desk. Adrian didn't look back. "Not now, Peterson. I have a crisis to manage." He reached the biometric scanner, a sleek, sapphire blue lens that had recognized the unique whirls of his thumbprint for 5 years. This was his throne room door. This was the barrier that separated him from the mere mortals on the street. He pressed his thumb against the glass, waiting for the familiar, satisfying chirp of the locks disengaging. Instead, the scanner flashed a violent, pulsating crimson. "Access denied, unknown user." Adrian froze, his thumb still pressed against the cold glass. He tried again, harder this time, as if physical force could compel the software to remember its creator. The red light flashed again, faster, accompanied by a low, dissonant buzz that vibrated in his teeth. "Is this a joke?" Adrian screamed, turning to the security desk. "Peterson, reset the system. The biometric array is malfunctioning." Peterson, a man who had bowed to Adrian every morning for half a decade, didn't move. He stood behind the reinforced desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression one of stony indifference. "The system is functioning perfectly, sir. It has been updated to reflect the new ownership." "New ownership?" Adrian's voice cracked, a high-pitched sound of pure desperation. "I am the owner. I am the chairman. I built this tower with my bare hands and $1 billion of my own sweat." "According to the 8:00 a.m. update," Peterson said, his voice as flat as a dial tone, "the Kessler Group no longer exists. This is now the Fairchild Plaza. Your credentials have been scrubbed from the local and cloud-based servers. You aren't just unauthorized, Mr. Kessler, you are a ghost." Adrian ignored him, longing for the service stairs. He pushed through the heavy fire doors, his breath coming in jagged, burning gasps as he began to climb. He didn't care that he was 60 floors down. He didn't care that his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. He had to get to the boardroom. He had to find the servers. He had to find the physical proof that he still existed. By the time he reached the 60th floor, his suit was ruined, his silk tie hanging like a noose around his neck. He burst through the stairwell door, expecting to see his staff, his loyal lieutenants, his secretaries, his sycophants, scrambling to help him. Instead, he found a graveyard of industry. The executive floor was silent. The desks were clear. The monitors were all glowing with the same singular image, a stylized emerald green F, the logo of the Fairchild Trust. It was everywhere. It was on the coffee mugs. It was on the digital wall art. It was even on the small nameplates of the desks where his vice presidents used to sit. Adrian stumbled toward his private office, the double mahogany doors standing open. He burst inside, expecting to find his leather chair and his view of the park. His chair was gone. His desk, the mahogany fortress where he had signed the divorce papers, had been replaced by a sleek, minimalist table of white marble. And sitting at that table, silhouetted against the rainy Manhattan skyline, was not a person, but a single, black and white photograph in a silver frame. It was a picture of Elias, Ileana, and Everett. They were laughing, piled together in the nursery he had called an anchor. "Where is everyone?" Adrian whispered, his voice echoing in the hollowed-out room. "Where is my life?" He rushed to the computer terminal on the marble table, frantically typing his administrative override codes. He knew the backdoors. He had designed the security architecture to be impenetrable to everyone but him. User admin. Password redacted. The screen flickered. A loading bar appeared. For a second, a spark of hope flared in Adrian's chest. Invalid code. Hint, have you checked the collateral? Adrian slumped into the guest chair, the only furniture left in the room. He realized now that the ghost in the boardroom wasn't a glitch in the software. It was the result of the paper trail to nowhere he had followed in the previous chapter. When he had signed the asset transfer deed, he hadn't just given away his money, he had given away his digital identity. He had signed a document that allowed the Fairchild Trust to rebrand and reindex all corporate assets. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the silicon-based world, Adrian Kessler had been deleted. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held the gold pen. They looked pale, translucent in the harsh lead light of the office. He felt like he was fadding. He had spent his entire life building a world that was entirely dependent on a network of permissions and passwords, and in one move, Naomi had revoked them all. A soft click sounded behind him. Adrian spun around. The giant monitors in the boardroom began to flicker to life, one by one. They weren't showing stock tickers or news reports. They were showing security footage, live feeds from the very building he was standing in. He saw himself on the screen. He saw the ghost standing in the middle of a white office, looking small and broken. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the sweat, the rain, and the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. "Do you like the view, Adrian?" The voice didn't come from the room. It came from the speakers, the high-end surround sound system he had installed to play classical music during his power lunches. It was Naomi's voice, but it wasn't the voice of the woman who had begged him to stay. It was the voice of a woman who was looking down at a bug she was about to crush. "Naomi," Adrian turned in a circle, looking for a hidden microphone. "Where are you? Come out and face me. This is illegal. You can't just delete a man's life." "I didn't delete it, Adrian," her voice echoed, cool and crystalline. "You sold it. You traded your access codes for a $20 billion dream that was never yours to hold. You thought you were storming your office, but you're just haunting a house that belongs to your children now." "I'll fight this," Adrian roared at the ceiling. "I'll find a lawyer who hasn't been bought. I'll take this to the Supreme Court." "With what money, Adrian? With what identity?" Naomi's laugh was a soft, chilling sound. "You have no assets. You have no standing. You are a trespasser in a building owned by the Fairchild Trust. And as for your security codes, I didn't change them. I just deactivated the account associated with Adrian Kessler. You see, the system doesn't recognize ghosts." The lights in the office began to dim, one by one, until the only thing illuminated was the photograph of the triplets. Adrian reached out to grab it, but as he touched the frame, the office doors began to slide shut, locking with a final, heavy thud. He was trapped in his own office, a king in a cage of his own making. The ghost in the boardroom was finally alone with the only thing he had left, the memory of the family he had called a liability. The monitors showed one final image before going dark, the word void in giant, emerald letters. Adrian Kessler sank to the floor, the darkness swallowing him whole. He had climbed 60 floors to find his power, only to find that the throne was empty and the crown was a shadow. The darkness of the locked office was not absolute. It was punctured by the rhythmic, taunting glow of the city's digital billboards reflecting off the rain-streaked glass. Adrian Kessler sat on the floor, his back against the cold marble table, listening to the hum of the building he no longer owned. He felt like a man buried alive in a tomb of his own design. But then, the heavy mahogany doors didn't just unlock. They hissed open with a mechanical grace that suggested the building itself was exhaling. Two men in the familiar charcoal suits of the Aegis group stood in the doorway. They didn't speak. They simply gestured toward the hallway. Adrian stood, his legs trembling, his pride a tattered rag. He followed them, not as a leader, but as a prisoner being led to the gallows. They didn't take him to the elevator. They led him to the rear of the executive floor, to a door he had always assumed was a utility closet. Inside was a private mahogany-lined study, a room that exhaled the scent of old money, leather-bound books, and tobacco, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern glass of Adrian's former office. And there, sitting behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from the hull of a 19th-century warship, was a man Adrian recognized from the grainy, blurred history books of Wall Street. It was Arthur Fairchild, the ghost of the exchange, the man who had disappeared from public life 20 years ago after building an empire that made Adrian's Kessler Group look like a lemonade stand. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face. He had spent his career trying to emulate this man's ruthlessness, never realizing he had been sleeping in the same house as his daughter for 7 years. "Sit down, Adrian," Arthur Fairchild said. His voice was like grinding stones, ancient and immovable. "You look like a man who has just discovered that the world isn't made of numbers, but of shadows." Adrian sank into a leather chair, his eyes darting around the room. "Naomi, she's your daughter. You're the board behind Aegis." "Aegis is a subsidiary of the Fairchild Trust," Arthur said, leaning forward into the light. His eyes were the same piercing, intelligent blue as the triplets. "My daughter chose a life of quietude. She wanted to know if a man could love her for the woman she was, rather than the ledger she inherited. She wanted a partner, Adrian. She wanted a home. I told her she was a romantic fool. I told her that men like you, men with Duke in their self-appointed titles, don't see people. They see assets." "I loved her," Adrian rasped, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "You loved the stability she provided while you climbed," Arthur corrected him. "You loved the $50,000 a year habit because it kept your house clean and your ego fed. But the moment a bigger asset appeared on the horizon, you didn't just leave her. You tried to erase her. You signed a dynastic purity clause because you believed that greatness required the abandonment of your own blood." The door behind Adrian opened, and Naomi stepped in. She was no longer the woman in the oversized sweatshirt from the studio apartment. She wore a tailored emerald suit, her hair styled in a sharp, professional bob. She carried a single folder, which she placed on her father's desk. She didn't look at Adrian with anger. She looked at him with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "The merger was never about money, Adrian," Naomi said, her voice steady. "It was a stress test. My father wanted to see if the man I chose was a titan or a parasite. The $20 billion was the bait. The purity clause was the trap. We wanted to see if you would value the legacy of the Fairchild name over the vanity of the Kessler name." "You lied to me," Adrian spat, a spark of his old rage flickering. "You let me believe we were struggling. You let me think I was the one providing for us." "I let you be the man you wanted to be," Naomi countered. "And you chose to be a man who sells his children for a seat at a table that was already yours by marriage. If you had stayed, Adrian, if you had looked at the merger and said, 'I won't leave my family for any price,' you would have been handed the keys to the Fairchild Empire this morning. You would have been the most powerful man in the world, not because of a contract, but because of your character." Adrian felt a sickening lurch in his gut. The $20 billion he had chased was a pittance compared to the Fairchild legacy. He had traded a diamond mine for a handful of salt. He had cut himself off from the very source of power he had spent his life trying to reach. "The triplets," Adrian whispered, "they're Fairchilds." "They are my heirs," Arthur Fairchild said, his voice dropping into a growl, "and they will never know your name. The dynastic purity clause you signed, it worked perfectly. It purified the line by removing the weakest link. You, by your own hand, you are legally a stranger to them. You are a voided entity in their history." Naomi walked over to the window, looking out at the city square below. "The crowd is gathering, Adrian. The news of the Fairchild acquisition has broken. The world is waiting to see the face of the new era, and they're waiting to see what happens to the man who thought he could outsmart the shadows. "What are you going to do to me?" Adrian asked, his voice trembling. "Do to you," Arthur laughed, a dry hacking sound. "We aren't going to do anything, we've already done it. We've given you exactly what you asked for. You wanted to be unencumbered. You wanted to be a man of singular focus. Well, look at you. You have no wife, no children, no home, no company, no assets. You are the most unencumbered man in New York. You are so light, Adrian, that you're practically invisible." Naomi turned back to him, holding out a single, one-way bus ticket to a small town in the Midwest, the kind of small place Adrian had mocked. "You called me a liability," Naomi said softly, "but you were the only liability in our lives. The children are safe, the money is secure, and the Duke is dead." Adrian looked at the ticket, then at the man who had been his idol, and finally at the woman who had been his soul. He realized that the father's shadow wasn't Arthur Fairchild's influence over the market. It was the shadow Adrian had been living in his entire life, too blind to see that the light was right in front of him. 24 hours, Adrian whispered, the weight of his failure finally crushing him. "I lost it all in 24 hours. "No," Arthur Fairchild said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "You lost it the moment you thought a number was worth more than a name. Now, get out of my building. You're trespassing on Fairchild property." The guards gripped Adrian's arms, but he didn't fight. He was a hollow man, a ghost in a suit, being led out of the light and into the cold, rainy reality of the street. The revelation was complete. He hadn't just lost a merger, he had lost the only kingdom that ever mattered. The descent from the heights of the Fairchild building felt less like a walk and more like a fall through a terminal vacuum. As the heavy brass and glass doors hissed shut behind him, the sound of the locks engaging was like a final heartbeat. Adrian Kessler stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, the cold New York drizzle instantly soaking through his $1,000 wool suit. For the first time in a decade, he was standing in the public square not as a conqueror, but as prey. The Duke had been stripped of his armor, and the wolves of Manhattan were already beginning to howl. The great leveling didn't happen in a single blow. It arrived in a series of digital and physical tremors. As Adrian stumbled away from the Fairchild monolith, his phone, the only tool he had left, began to vibrate with a violent, unending frequency. It wasn't the congratulatory pings of the elite, it was the staccato rhythm of ruin. "Private lender for collateral default DETCTD. Seizure initiated. Veloce Automobili, account fraud reported. AUTHORITIS NOTIFID. Penthouse management, LOCKS changed. Personal effects, REMANDD2 storage." Adrian leaned against a cold street lamp, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He tried to dial his private fixer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. The call didn't even go through. A robotic voice informed him that his service had been suspended due to non-payment. The $20 billion phantom had evaporated, and in its wake, every debt he had leveraged to build his house of cards was being called in at once. He started to walk, but the city square was no longer a place of anonymity. The news ticker on the side of the Reuters building was screaming his failure in giant, pixelated letters. KSSLER Group declared insolvent. ADRAN KSSLER sought for questioning in asset fraud. "There he is," a voice shouted. Adrian spun around. A group of men in dark raincoats, process servers and private investigators hired by the banks he had outsmarted on his way up, were closing in from the north side of the square. Behind them followed a swarm of paparazzi, their flashbulbs popping like miniature explosions against the gray sky. They weren't looking for a quote, they were looking for the carcass of a fallen god. He turned and ran. His expensive Italian loafers, designed for carpeted boardrooms and marble foyers, slipped on the wet cobblestones. He dodged between yellow taxis and annoyed commuters, but the square was a trap. The very tunnel vision the public felt toward his success had now flipped into a microscopic focus on his demise. "Mr. Kessler, did you really trade your children for a voided contract?" A reporter screamed, thrusting a microphone toward his face as he ducked into an alleyway. "Leave me alone," Adrian roared, his voice cracking. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, the physical manifestation of his ego finally dying. He emerged from the alley back into the center of the square, only to find himself surrounded. To his left, the creditors, men with cold eyes and legal folders that felt like death warrants. To his right, the public, the commoners he had mocked, now holding up their phones to record the most spectacular ego death in the history of the borough. And then the motorcade arrived. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled to a silent, synchronized stop in the middle of the square. The crowd fell hushed as the doors opened. Adrian froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected the police. He expected handcuffs. Instead, he saw the emerald green dress. Naomi stepped out of the lead vehicle. She was flanked by Arthur Fairchild's security detail, but she didn't need them. The power radiating from her was enough to create a vacuum of silence in the crowded plaza. She looked at Adrian, and in her eyes, he saw the finality of the great leveling. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't the mother of his children. She was the personification of the market correction he had spent his life trying to outrun. Adrian's knees finally gave out. It wasn't a choice. It was a biological surrender. He collapsed onto the wet stones of the square, sinking to his knees in the center of a circle of cameras and creditors. The blood and grime from a stumble in the alley smeared his forehead, adding a visceral, physical toll to his financial ruin. He looked up at her, his mouth open in a silent, guttural scream that no one could hear over the sudden roar of the wind. "The bank teller was right, Adrian," Naomi said, her voice amplified by the silence of the crowd. "The balance is zero, but not just in your accounts. You are zero. Your name is a void. Your legacy is a ghost." Thorne, standing behind her, held out a single document. It was the void anchor, the formal notice that the Aegis merger had been terminated for a bad faith breach of character. He dropped it at Adrian's feet. The paper landed in a puddle, the ink beginning to bleed into the dirty water. "You wanted to be the Duke," Naomi whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "But you forgot that every duke serves a crown. You chose a crown of gold, Adrian. I chose a crown of blood. My children will never know the man who knelt in the mud for $20 billion. They will only know the mother who took it back." As the flashbulbs intensified, Adrian realized the true nature of the great leveling. It wasn't about the loss of the money. It was about the loss of the gaze. For years, people had looked at him with fear or envy. Now they looked at him with witness shame. He was a cautionary tale, a public humiliation captured in 4K resolution to be shared across the world in seconds. He was being hunted by his own reflection. The floating $100 bills, remnants of a promotional stunt for the merger that had gone awry in the wind, swirled around him, mocking his poverty. He reached out to grab one, his fingers clawing at the air, but the wind snatched it away, blowing it toward Naomi. She didn't even look at the money. She turned her back on him and stepped back into the SUV. "Wait," Adrian croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Naomi, please, I have nothing." The door closed with a heavy final thud. The creditors moved in, their hands reaching for his shoulders to serve the papers that would tie him to legal battles for the next 30 years. The paparazzi pressed closer, their lenses inches from his weeping eyes. Adrian Kessler, the man who once looked down on the world from a 60-floor throne, was now the lowest point in the city. The leveling was complete. The Duke was a beggar, and the square was his only kingdom. He stayed there, on his knees in the rain, a living monument to the fact that when you trade your soul for a number, the market always finds a way to bring you back to zero. The public square had become a theater of the macabre, a sprawling stage where the Duke of Wall Street was being systematically unmade. Adrian Kessler remained on his knees, his hands pressed into the cold, all-slicked grit of the pavement. The rain had slowed to a haunting mist, clinging to his ruined suit like a shroud. He looked up, his vision blurred by tears and the harsh, rhythmic strobe of 100 paparazzi flashes. The crowd of creditors and spectators had parted, creating a path of absolute, suffocating silence. At the end of that path stood the SUV, its engine purring with a mechanical indifference to his suffering. Then the door opened again. This time Naomi didn't just step out, she emerged with the gravity of a sovereign. Behind her, 3 nannies followed in silent formation, each pushing a high-end, obsidian-black stroller. Elias, Ileana, and Everett, the triplets Adrian had called liabilities and anchors, were awake. They sat in their carriages, their eyes wide and curious, looking at the bright lights of the city. They were untouched by the grime, the rain, or the scandal. They were the heirs to an empire Adrian could no longer even name. Adrian felt a surge of desperate, pathetic hope. He tried to stand, but his legs were leaden, his spirit too heavy to lift. "Naomi," he choked out, the words sounding like a death rattle. "Look at them, they need a father. You can't let them see me like this. Tell them who I am." Naomi walked toward him, her emerald green dress trailing over the wet stones. She stopped exactly 3 feet away, the distance between a queen and a commoner. She didn't look down at him with the fire of a woman scorned. There was no screaming, no theatrical slapping of his face, no vengeful tirade. Instead, she offered him the one thing more terrifying than her rage, her silence. It was a silence that contained the weight of every night she had spent alone while he was building his kingdom. It was a silence that held the echoes of every time he had dismissed her intellect as a small-town habit. She looked at him with a clinical, detached pity, as if he were a ghost she had finally finished mourning. "They don't see you, Adrian," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the square like a thunderclap. "To them, you are just a man in the rain, a stranger who lost his way." "I'm their father," Adrian screamed, a final, futile spark of ego flaring up. He reached out a trembling hand toward Elia's stroller. The security detail didn't even have to move. Naomi simply stepped into his line of sight, her presence an impenetrable wall. A father is a title earned through loyalty, not a biological byproduct. You traded that title for $20 billion. The transaction is complete, Adrian. The receipt is in your hand. She reached into her small, beaded clutch and pulled out a single, gold-nibbed pen, the very pen Adrian had used to sign the divorce papers on their anniversary. She dropped it into the puddle next to his knee. "You can keep the pen," she said. "You'll need it to sign the bankruptcy filings. My father's attorneys have ensured that your name will be removed from the birth certificates by the end of the week. A dynastic purity measure, as you called it. We wouldn't want any domestic liabilities affecting the Fairchild Trust's growth." Adrian looked at the pen, then back at the strollers. The triplets were looking past him, their gazes caught by the giant digital ticker atop the Fairchild building. The letters were scrolling in a rhythmic, relentless march. Fairchild Trust acquires KSSLER Global. All TIDMARKS voided. ADI and KSSLER removed from all corporate history. He realized then the true scale of the new queen's victory. She wasn't just taking his money, she was erasing his existence. She was rewriting the past so that he had never happened. To the world, and eventually to his children, he would be a footnote of failure, a void in a lineage of greatness. "Please," Adrian whispered, his forehead touching the cold ground. "Just let me say goodbye, just once." Naomi didn't answer. She turned away, her emerald dress catching the golden light of the street lamps, making her look like a jewel in a city of stone. She walked back to the SUVs, her pace steady and unhurried. She didn't look back at the cameras. She didn't look back at the creditors who were now descending on Adrian like vultures on a carcass. She reached the strollers and leaned down, kissing each of the triplets on their foreheads. The nannies lifted the children into the vehicles. The doors closed with a synchronized, heavy thud, the sound of a vault locking for eternity. As the motorcade began to pull away, the crowd surged forward. The great leveling was moving into its final phase. The press wanted their closing shot. The process servers wanted their signatures. Adrian remained on his knees, a broken statue in the center of a storm. He watched the red taillights of Naomi's car disappear into the Manhattan traffic, taking with them his money, his family, and his name. He reached for the gold pen in the puddle, his fingers closing around the cold metal. It was the only thing he had left. No $20 billion, no penthouse, no duke status, just a pen that no longer had anything of value to sign. The new queen had left the board, taking the entire game with her. Adrian Kessler was left in the rain, a man who had sold the sun to buy a shadow, finally realizing that in the world of high-stakes karma, The silence of a woman you betrayed is the loudest sound you will ever hear. The void wasn't a bank balance. The void was the rest of his life. The story concludes in the heart of New York City, where the scales of justice have been violently recalibrated. Adrian Kessler, the man who believed he could quantify the value of a human soul, is left as a literal and figurative zero. The dramatic inversion is complete. The discarded liability has become the sovereign of the city's most powerful empire, while the Duke has become a cautionary tale of hubris. The final image of Naomi and the triplets departing in a motorcade signifies not just a departure, but an ascension, a family purified by the removal of the man who never deserved them. The narrative serves as a stark reminder that power without principle is a debt that eventually comes due. Adrian traded invaluable love for variable currency, failing to realize that loyalty is the only asset that doesn't depreciate. He lost everything in 24 hours because he measured his life in zeros rather than in the faces of his children. The story proves that the greatest wealth isn't found in a merger agreement, but in the integrity of the person holding the pen. If you enjoyed this tale of ultimate revenge and poetic justice, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and comment justice below. Do you think Adrian got what he deserved, or was Naomi too cold? Let us know your thoughts. And if you want to see more arrogant titans get leveled by the people they underestimated, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Remember, karma doesn't miss a deadline.